single market stories by business leaders. The opening film gave you a glimpse of its tone and content. And we are convinced that this is the right moment to launch such a campaign, given the challenges the EU faces today. When Jacques Delors, president of the European Commission from 1985 to 1995, set out to build the single market, he was leading Europe out of an economically difficult times in the early 1980s. President Delors did so by pulling together political support for the harmonization of rules across the 12 countries, which were part of the European Economic Community at this time. He mobilized the machinery of the European Commission and national governments to remove legal, administrative, and technical obstacles. This was an epic undertaking, and he succeeded in creating the single market 30 years ago in 1992. In doing so, he managed to give a much needed boost to the EU competitiveness, which had fallen behind on the rapidly advancing American and Japanese economies. Today, you would say and would think that this is kind of a moment of déjà vu. The challenges of the twin transition, coupled with the unprecedented twists and turns of the pandemics, have resulted in one of the worst economic shocks since the World War II. This is why the European Union now needs to re-embark on a similar ambitious agenda. The single market is a vital part of the puzzle if we are to achieve net zero by 2050, while remaining competitive and still playing a meaningful role on the world stage. In the summer of 2020, EU heads of state and government were able to agree on an unprecedented recovery package of 750 billion. And it is still unclear whether the current recovery package is sufficient in order to jumpstart the European economy. I believe that completing the single market can and should be part of the solution. According to the calculations of the European Commission, a similar sum of more than 700 billion euros can be unleashed in the coming decade by removing national barriers to the single market. But what if all require is political courage and administrative determination at EU and national levels, a determination to firmly resolve obstacles to the free movement of people, goods, services, and capital across the borders. Our new publication, Renewing the Dynamic of European Integration, which ERT is launching today, is about addressing the internal problems, both present and upcoming, that erode the EU's ability to behave as truly unified community. The stories we have gathered from 30 business leaders in 13 countries highlight real problems that need fixing. They offer ideas for how the single market can be brought to the next level. Each of the 30 stories in the publication is told by a member of ERT, highlighting a problem which relates to the single market. These range from issues around labeling, recycling initiatives, the free movement of waste and cross-border flow of renewable energy, to challenges around emerging areas such as cloud computing, health data, and the scaling up of hydrogen, just to name a few. Let me give you 3 examples. For BASF, we notice firsthand that an uncoordinated approach of energy infrastructure across member states stand in the way of progress on reaching the climate objectives. We have invested in the world's largest offshore wind farm in the North Sea off the Dutch coast, but insufficient interconnectors, grid bottlenecks, and surcharges on renewable electricity prevent, for example, our major site in Ludwigshafen in Germany from sourcing this sustainably produced energy. Another example illustrates the lack of the freedom of movement of goods in the EU. The chair of Akzo Nobel indicates that a single pot of paint cannot be sold across the single market, but needs to be adapted to the own standards of Germany, Belgium, and France to conform to indoor air quality rules. It means that the same pot of paint requires different labels and different administrative processes to get it tested or scored per market. Such patchwork of national rules slow down efforts to make buildings more sustainable. In the field of digital transformation, the CEO of Nokia explains in his story how the lack of timely and harmonized 5G spectrum assignments across EU member states has caused a lag effect on the digitalization of European companies, thus not only undermining the single market, but also Europe's global competitiveness. Right now, the headwinds facing the EU competitiveness are powerful. Reinvesting efforts in the single market is a very important enabler for economic recovery in the coming decade. Completing the single market is also necessary to achieve the green and digital transition because companies need sufficient scale to develop and expand new technologies rapidly. This publication is also ERT's contribution to the Conference of the Future of Europe, underway at the moment. Citizens are rightfully asking more action from the European Union. So we as business leaders support an ambitious outcome of the conference in the spring of 2022. Europe has always grown strongly in times of crisis. Generating new sources of growth by further integrating our economies will be beneficial to all. Today's announcement, therefore, marks also a return to the original roots of ERT. As such, an announcement was addressed already in the early 1980s by European industrialists. At the same time, ERT called for the creation of a truly common market at an event hosted by SEPS in 1984 in a visionary document called An Agenda for Action, Europe 1990. With our call to deepen the single market, we wish to renew our commitment to strengthening the European Union and strengthening Europe's place in the world. There is so much to gain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. And as I said, impressive report. I found it extremely well done. I think it's very useful that what you're doing now is there on the table. But what I wanted to ask you, if you look back over these almost 40 years, we have progressed, but we also have made mistakes. If you look back over these 40 years, what do you think has been the main achievements and what are the main pitfalls of our progress?
Well, actually, I think, if you look back, to be in all fairness, we have achieved the single market starting from zero. But I think that is exactly also the problem we have today, because the single market is taken for granted. As, by the way, many other European achievements, they basically checked and they are accepted, but no one deals with them anymore, which is to a certain extent also not surprising, given all the difficult moments and difficult topics we have ahead of us. But if you look in detail on the single market, yes, it works to a large extent, but it could work even much better. And it could actually release such an important impulse in terms of generating additional wealth and GDP, which is currently lacking because there is no attention anymore to the single market. And I think this is partially from the European Commission, but it is also from the member states. And I would even dare to say it is by the ordinary citizen taking as granted. And this is, I think, why after these 30 years, we should be, in all fairness, we as business leaders, and I say this also as a European citizen, I'm extremely proud of what we have achieved. And in my eyes, it is the major achievement Europe has done in the last 30 years. But that's in the same moment also exactly why I think we have to have the ambition now to really complete the single market in every aspect.
I see there is already one of the panel members who wants to raise a question to you, but of course we will have the panel starting after 12 o'clock. But if I look specifically at your sector, Martin, the chemical sector, I see if I look at the report, you're asking, and for certain sector, even more harmonization. But if you look in the areas I follow, which I know best is financial markets, for example, we now have such a complexity of regulation that some people would say, look, we need to have a simplification of all the rules which we have. In your sector, we had REACH, which is also seen to be extremely complex, but on the other hand, is seen to be a worldwide standard and is followed in other countries. How would you look at this?
Yeah, I mean, this is true. I mean, as I said, there are elements that are good, but that's not all dimensions are good. This is why I addressed from my story, not REACH, because that is a great achievement here. But I addressed the next challenge, which is actually coming with the net zero ambition. And that means we have to play also the energy card, really, truly European. But do we have an energy single market in Europe? No, we don't have. We have national agendas. We now fight for the right energy mix in Europe, from nuclear to what the role of natural gas is and where and how we develop renewable energy. So we are far away from harmony. But that means we have taken care about some elements. But going further, there are new elements which we have to do. And Karel, this was also one of the reasons structurally in the report that we have focused actually on 4 main areas, not to get it too diverse, which is digital, energy, environment, and finance, because I think those 4 are somehow common denominators for many of the industries at the very end. And they are also in full resonance with the Green Deal. I think these are the 4 levers which we have to get right. I mean, a unified capital market, environmental standards throughout the region, digitalization I talked about. I mean, if we get that right, and we get that right in a way how we have organized other things, it is a huge impulse which we get in Europe. And I think we all agree we anyway suffer from rather low growth rates. And I think this could give a boost to economic growth, and we need desperately this.
There's a comment saying that, look, what you're doing is extremely good, and that's what we need. But we know the problem. Member states have different views, and they cannot agree.
That is true, Karel, and I think this is our overall European problem. We have always this balance and this counteraction between Europe trying to get a certain moment into it and drive it really the European agenda, and then having separate member states that holding back and having their own national agenda. I think this is the struggle of Europe from day one with the design. But I mean, what is concerning, and I agree with you, we have some nationalist tendencies or trends in Europe with some countries and some governments who rather to try to distance from Europe. But I think this is very clearly, this is why we address this. This is not only a topic for the European Commission. It is actually a topic for each and every national government. And I think the governments very well know where they have bent the rules and how they actually escape from the one or the other standard. And this is exactly leading to these puzzle elements which you as a company face. If you want to sell your goods in all the countries, you realize I have to do so many different things. It's not reducing the growth. It is also taking a lot of resources because you spend them on administrative parts instead of, for example, dedicating them to innovation. And this is why I think this agenda has really been taken up in all the national governments. They have to do their stake that is actually working.
I said again, plenty of comments and reactions, which are along the lines of what you just said. There's one specific question about, of course, you mentioned specifically energy. And there's one specific question, let's say, do people know, let's say, what is missing to create a single market for services? Energy is basically a service which is provided to customers. But I think if I look at it personally, let's say that citizens in Europe do not know sufficiently that we don't have a single market in energy. They think we have it because you can buy your supplies from other countries, but say you buy energy from other countries, but the supplies itself is not directed, say, European-wide. It is a national competence. So that's one of the questions, but what do you propose specifically in the single market for services in general, not only energy?
I think services is maybe the most difficult sector because service is just one word, but there are hundreds and thousands of different services. But what is interesting, Karel, we in the ERT, we do every 6 months, we do our kind of confidence survey. And we were asking actually at the last one where we just released 1 or 2 weeks ago, our results, and you can see them in the internet. We actually asked, and that was interesting because it was actually pointed out that for services, we have the least complete single market in Europe, very much below the movement of goods and people. And that shows really that this is something I think simply from the fact that services and the diversity of services and the quality of services, think also about the digital part, they have developed so rapidly compared to 30 years ago when the single market was actually founded and created. And since that 30 years, we have not done much on actually taking care about how we can services flow in Europe. So it's a very logic thing. I think also that for services, we are further away than from goods. And for that reason, I can only urge European Commission and the national governments to take care particularly about the services, because as we move also partly away from certain industries, we reshuffle also how our economy will look in the future, and it will be more service-driven. That's, I think, also on a way of development of GDP, let's say, in the world. So I think services and the free flow of services extremely important.
I agree, let's say, because they are a huge chunk, the biggest chunk of our economy. There's another question regarding environmental legislation, where a person remarks, Dennis Kredler, that we see more divergences which are allowed by the treaty rather than convergence in this domain. So how would you look at this, or what would you say to policymakers in designing environmental policies in this sense? If you see that these sensitivities are different from member states, we can lead to different pieces of legislation, which are barriers to the single market.
Yeah, take example, the Zero Pollution Action Plan that came out, which I think leads some or gives some first ideas what is going to happen with emissions in water, air, and soil. And if you look at that, what is now foreseen, that this is thousands of national legislations that have to be adapted to the plan in Europe, which is another administrative disaster. Just imagine about all the permits that have to be adapted in each and every nation according to that. I think it really recalls that also on a European level, someone who produces a certain good doesn't have to be chemicals or whatever, you have the same conditions. So I can only urge also here, we have to harmonize. And harmonization does not always mean to make it more complicated. And this is a little bit where I'm concerned sometimes now with what's coming out with the Green Deal. It is so many more regulations. It would be also the direction having maybe less regulations, but then having them unified and harmonized over Europe. So absolutely, this is another area where we have to go for that.
Fully agree with your point, let's say, that it shouldn't be more complex, but I see in the domain I know best, financial services, it's a complexity which has become enormous, and the adaptations are always done, which I think in environmental legislation is also the case, because there are wishes for every member state and everybody has its approaches, and then you try to make sense of what is on the table as a company, and you basically discover it's almost impossible to find your way as a kind of a fully single market. We also have, let's say, a comment which I wanted to bring up here from Malcolm Harbour. Malcolm is a former chair of the Single Market Committee at the European Parliament, British. And basically he says that, yeah, we have been saying these things since a long time. And we have said it in previous reports. We have even said it in a report which came out just before the Brexit referendum in the UK. And we still have to repeat it and to repeat it, but it's only a comment, it's not a question. I have another question, I mean, about protectionism and economic nationalism, let's say, which people say they agree with what you say, which is why, in fact, we need to renew this commitment to the single market. So another endorsement of what the ERT and what you're proposing. And of course, then there is the issue about the role of the court and, I mean, the European Court, but then we have also the Court of Auditors, which have insisted on the lack of action by the EU, by the EU Commission, probably by the member states together, let's say, really enforcing what we have.
Karel, just maybe a quick comment here also, because I mean, we are not the only one who are addressing the single market. There are many other associations have done this, and it's also good. It's amplifying itself. And the pure fact that we have now to say this again certainly doesn't solve the problem. But if you don't bring it to the table, no one takes care. So I think for that reason, sometimes we all know this to be persistent in things also move something. We all know that from our daily lives. And that's also why, let me maybe say this, we have also focused to make it more simple in the report that we actually made 3 major recommendations. I mean, the first one is simply about speed and simplicity. We need, and this is then just one example or an idea how to get it done, is that we need more mutual recognition also of national legislation, if you have them. The same is also true for industry standardization. We are simply to accelerate decision-making in the EU about this, which, by the way, is something I think we see throughout Europe in each and everything. We are too slow. And then it is really about the red tape that should really be avoided, and the EU-level regulatory alignment should be really fostered. The second thing is really aligning on ends and means. That means the European Community and Commission and the member states, and exactly the two, actually should take bold steps in harmonizing wherever this is necessary and helpful to achieve, let's say, goals and removing barriers. And my experience is the more simple you make the system, actually, the more and better it works later. And then the third element, and that comes then in top of that, is the better enforcement. The better enforcement of the common rules is really needed to ensure that we have consistency between the member states, also in terms of interpreting EU legislation. Because it sometimes starts that the proposal from Brussels is so complicated that all the states do an interpretation, and it allows for the interpretation, which then leads into different national legislation. So also here, if we would make it more simple, more clear, you have less space to interpret it in a way that is maybe a national advantage. So I think this is 3 very practical recommendations, not to make it too complicated, and just should give a hint that we don't walk our way now because we say it is so complicated, we better don't touch it. We have other stuff which is more prioritized. So there are simple ways, and this is 3 of the recommendations we make to really attack it.
And that's, I think, very important that it comes from a group of CEOs which are confronted with these kind of questions on a day-to-day basis, and large corporations.
But also here, Karel, one quick comment. I mean, yes, the ERT, that is about 60 CEOs of large, big companies, and it's truly European because it's from all the countries and different sectors and whatever. But let me also very clearly say, I think the good thing is the ERT has a credible voice. But we are not speaking only for the big company. If you actually talk to SMEs, their problems are the same, even sometimes bigger, because they have the same problem. They have one product. To sell that in the European market overwhelms them with the resources they need to do so. So I think we clearly speak for the industry, not only for the big companies, because the small ones don't have a voice. So I want to really make this clear. We talk for the industrial ecosystem.
Thanks a lot. And I think I like also the visual nature of your report. One of the recommendations is there, or one of the stories is about what it takes to make a single pot of paint. And that's fantastic. Let's say that is, but also there are other fantastic stories in there. You have first the analysis in that report, and then these 30 kind of more kind of specific experiences from each CEO in a specific industry. And it's extremely kind of highlighting, let's say, the problems which you have in all these specific sectors. Thank you, Martin. We will now move to a brief video message of Vestager, Commissioner Vestager, who will give her impressions about the report, let's say for 5 minutes, and then we will turn to the panel, to the 4 panelists which we have, let's say, to have their reactions on the report, and then we will have another possibility for have Q&A, so questions and answers with the participants in this webinar. So Martin, thank you very much for this great report, and I hope you'll stay with us, let's say, that you probably can comment in the second part of the session.
Will do. Thanks, Karel.
Dear all, it's a pleasure to be with you today, even if only by video. The single market is the crown jewel of the European Union, as well as a topic dear to my heart, as you may know. and I'm definitely going to miss the interesting exchanges that you will have today. Today, the European Roundtable publishes an impressive document on the single market. Not just a new report, a story. The story of the single market told by the many business leaders that experiences it every day and make it what it is. Quite an original and remarkable approach, I must say. We all know what the single market is, or at least we think we know. The theory is simple. Freedom of goods, services, movement and capital across our union. No additional cost or regulatory burden wherever you're doing business. And 450 million potential customers at arm's reach. But there is a long road from theory to practice. As always, the devil hides in the details. It can sometimes be hard for policymakers to identify all the large and tiny bumps in the experience of the European level playing field. Well, that's what the new ERT report provides. A map of all the bumps. An accurate picture of the single market drawn from field trips and real-life observations. Some insights were new to me, others more familiar. For instance, the need for streamlined European rules on setting up electrical car charging points, or the multiplicity of national cloud certification schemes that prevent EU cloud actors from stepping up. I will of course look at all these facts in more detail together with my colleagues to see where and how we can act. But the diagnosis in itself is highly valuable. It confirms we are on the same line. We must make the single market greener, more digital and more resilient. 2 weeks ago, I presented the review of our competition policy, covering all competition tools. An unprecedented exercise in scope and in reach. In many ways, it mirrors the experience-based approach that the ERT used. We started with cases and facts. Then, we assessed whether our tools are working. And where needed, we proposed solutions and improvements. That's particularly true when it comes to using our competition tools to support our green and digital transition. Let me just give you some examples. Competition is a driving force to fight climate change. And that is why we will make it easier for companies to cooperate in order to develop more sustainable products or production processes. On the digital side, we're working very hard to deliver the Digital Markets Act as soon as in 2023, implemented. And the new regulation will help to create a digital single market where all players, big and small, gets a fair chance to make it. To conclude, I'm convinced that competition policy is a solution to build a greener, more digital and more resilient single market. But competition policy alone cannot get us there. Together with member states, we must continue our work on removing national barriers to the single market. Europe's competitiveness is at stake. Just like you did, we must always let our actions be guided by people, by the ground. As Julius Caesar used to say, experience is the teacher of all things. Your exchanges in today's event will no doubt generate many ideas and comments on what can be done to bring a new impetus to the single market. I'm looking forward to hearing about them. I wish you all a very interesting debate. Thank you very much.
So thanks from our side to Vice President Vestager for this interesting views on that report. We now turn to the panel. I see Kerstin just was on her screen, but we have 3 other very interesting panelists as well. We have Andreas, who's with CEPS, but who was before that with the Regulatory Scrutiny Board in the Commission, so he knows all about benefit cost analysis. We have Nathalie Erard from Airbus, Head of European Affairs and Senior Vice President, and we have a government representative, Helene Bakker, Director in the Ministry of Economic Affairs. But we start with Kerstin Jorna. Kerstin, very well known. Kerstin is Director General of DG Grow. So Kerstin, what are your views on this report? What do you think? Of course, you will welcome it. You will be happy because you get more work. But is it feasible? Can we do this? I mean, and also as Martin said, let's say we don't need more complexity. We need to simplify regulation. Can we do this?
Of course we can. And what I'd like to do in my introductory remarks is, not to reply to the report, but I'd like to broaden the perspective a bit. What I'd like to talk about is the single market and the changing perspectives that we've had, and sometimes how perspectives have added on to perspectives we already had. When we look back to the 50s, the single market was part, in particular, of a peace project, because it brought together coal and steel. It made sure that we had food for our population, and it allowed us to rebuild Europe. Now, when we came to the 80s, it all started with an éclat. It started with an éclat because the Court of Justice in the Cassis de Dijon judgment said, hang on, member states, this is not okay. And they invented, more or less, the principle of mutual recognition. And that triggered a new process where also because of the contributions that were mentioned before, we had a new perspective on the single market in the white paper, the Delors white paper. We saw it as a legal scaffolding that we had to build to create the rules that allowed for companies to actually act in the single market and to make this mutual recognition idea flying and working on the ground. So we were all building something like 300 different legislations, removing every time 12 national legislations by one legislation. And we also had a new lawmaking machine, which was the Single Act, which allowed to adopt single market legislation by qualified majority, which facilitated our lawmaking and made it more agile. Now we're in 2021 and looking forward, the perspective that we add on to these other two perspectives now is really a single market economy, a mature market. I want to give some examples. Look at SMEs. The single market is the go-to market. 80% of the experts of SMEs, they are in the single market. The single market is also the treasure chest for our companies. If we didn't have the single market, our something like 10% of our capital stocks would just evaporate, and they would no longer be available to serve as a collateral for future investments. We also see the single market as the my turf phenomenon, because if you look at foreign direct investment, half of it in the single market actually is by countries, member states, is from member states into member states. So it's in our neighborhood that we trust. The single market also has shown to be the raincoat for very heavy weather. In the recent COVID pandemic, still continuing, but inside the economy lost speed inside the single market -7%, but when it globally, it was 9%. We also saw that we managed to produce, not only invent, but also produce the vaccines that we needed for our population, and not only in Europe, also beyond. We're exporting. We are the vaccine facility for the world. We managed to give ourselves the means, instrument to protect our workers in short-term employment and to make sure that all member states, everywhere in the single market, could afford with their national employment security systems to keep workers in work. And Next Generation EU, we also have a common and joined up plan with 750 billion to rebuild our economies. We also have the Brussels effect, another example, where because, and sometimes in a difficult process, but we managed to identify a common good like REACH legislation. It sets the standard for the world. And the last example I want to give why we should talk about single market economy rather than single market. Single market economy is now our new approach about the ecosystem lens that we apply to understand what's happening in the different and the 14 biggest industrial ecosystems. And that takes me to the second point. The 2021 plus perspective is not only single market economy, it's also single market economy in transition, because that's the next big project that's in front of us. It's, where is the business case, and how can, in our single market economy, we build the business case for this green, digital, and resilient transition and business? If you look at a business case, you always have five things. It's technology, it's inputs, it's regulation, it's skills, and it's market. Now, how can we support these? That's what we need to do and that's where the single market can provide the right scale. Technology, promoting research, the Horizon program, the biggest we ever had for the next 7 years. Inputs, renewable electricity. I take the point I hear on the electricity market. How can we produce that decarbonized electricity that we will need to decarbonize our industry? And we are talking about thousands of terawatts here. Raw materials, where do we actually get these inputs? Again, the single market will provide the answer here, from lithium to permanent magnets, rare earth. It's only Europe in a broader geopolitical setting that can ensure that these inputs will be coming. Skills. We have the blueprints and the roundtables and the skills pact to actually look at the skills and make sure that we have the skills up front before we engage into the transition, and that we will not leave anybody behind. And then, of course, market. We need the markets for these new products, and we need the right regulation to make sure that the demand is there as well. But not only regulation inside the EU, but also, which is, for example, on circular products, but also for the future and for other countries. And that's where our cooperation with the US is really important. Now, what are the next steps in this single market economy in transition and the developments? It's transition pathways for the industrial ecosystems. How can we make sure that we understand what's lacking to make the business case happen? And of course, tourism ecosystem has very different things to address than, for example, energy-intensive industries. It's the single market emergency instrument that our president announced, because what we've seen is that in the crisis, the single market, we have to keep it working, because that's, as I said, the raincoat, but we can make it work better. It's also our in-depth reviews on supply chain vulnerabilities. We did a first round, we announced a second round in our industrial strategy, and we will need to keep watching this and make sure that our industries have the inputs for their transformation. And therefore, I think when we talk about single market, we need to bear in mind all the three perspectives that I've just described as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerstin. Can I add one quick question? I mean, and it's also related to a question which came up before already. Is this whole environmental transition or the green transition not adding to complexity rather than reducing complexity? Meaning, certainly for SMEs, of which you spoke as well, will this not make it extremely complex to do business all over the EU?
Well, let me say to you, and those who've highlighted, all the lacuna and complexity being one, maybe is there something like an optimum single market? And I'm choosing my words here because there's a lot of discussion, many of you will know, about the optimum currency area. So what makes the optimum single market? From my point of view, it's not complexity or the number of rules. What we have to focus on is really how we mix the instruments and how we get better at mixing different instruments. We have regulation at national level was mentioned, at European level. We have investments from different sources. We have value chains. We need to bring this together. And bringing it together requires a shared vision. And it's really important to have that shared vision. It's more difficult with 12 member states than with 27, sure. But I do believe that the Green Deal vision and the digital compass, they express that shared vision. And let me say one thing, and this is, to your complex point. We have a model of collaboration and co-creation. Transition pathways is one of the examples. This is in stark contrast what you'd see with the United States, for example, where I would say it's unchained private initiative that has to do it. And if you look at China, it's very much chained top-down initiative. What we try to do in Europe is to have the collaboration. If you look at our standardization model, which brings together private and public, working together in addition to regulation, a very smart mix, actually. If you look at our alliances, hydrogen, we will be the first hydrogen market in the world, because what we do is we bring in our hydrogen alliance more than 1,000 companies who've developed more than 700 projects, from creating the hydrogen to storing it, transporting it, to using it at the factory gate. So we started up. Of course, bringing in so many people makes it complex, but on the other side, bringing it together and doing it in a good way. And that's where I see the challenge for us, for the single market economy, bringing all these instruments together in a better way. And the complex, simple analysis, I think, is not enough. I don't think that would be one element for, like Robert Mendel, one of the 5 he had for the perfect or the optimum current area. So I think we need we need to make it work, but complex simple is maybe.
No, I like your comparison with the optimum single market. What is the, let's say, the optimum, whatever, single currency area? We turn to Andreas. Andreas, as I said, who was with the single, amongst others, with the scrutiny board, but also has a lot of expertise in development economics and regulatory matters. So, Andreas, what are your views on this report, and how do you look at this, the things which came up already before in the debate?
No, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the early access to this fascinating set of hands-on experience of the CEOs. I think it is an important message to make. Martin mentioned that we take too much for granted. I think it's even worse. There is a growing rhetoric, given the supply chain difficulties, that international trade has gone too far. And I think it is important even to reiterate classical arguments. The larger the markets, the more consumers have choices, and the more intermediate goods are available for companies, which makes them more productive. And Martin has mentioned the estimate of the 700 billion. I think that's only a one-off benefit of deepening the internal market, the single market. I think that it is incentivizing more innovation if you have a more integrated market, because invention and investment in knowledge production pays off in a larger home market much better than if there are remains of fragmentation. So I think that this will be, over time, even a much larger advantage of deepening the single market. And it will be something that is a precondition also for the green transition. We need to some extent leave old technology development paths and transgress to another path that is serving the green economy. More generally, I think that what is the main points of the agenda of the current Commission amplifies the need to do more to complete the single market. One is digitalization, and this requires, first of all, to function a renewed effort in standardization, but it doesn't stop there. Digitalization will generate network economies, and network economies can only be exploited if there is a large integrated market. And it also has an enormous impact on where innovators locate. And it looks as if in this respect, Europe even has to catch up. There is another aspect of the single market that concerns the green transition, and in particular climate policy. We all know that climate policy can only be successful if it is a global policy. Even if we only Europe reduced emissions to zero, it would not mean much for climate change. But the single market is the most important instrument to create coalitions that are with us in doing a climate policy agenda and being successful globally. I think that this is an additional dimension of the single market that should be communicated more and communicated better also to the capitals. This is maybe related to a more general function of the single market in being instrumental also for foreign policy. And this is why the communication of trade policy talks about the open strategic autonomy. And I think that like in climate policy, the single market has an instrumental function to achieve open strategic autonomy. Malcolm Harbour's comments also play to this. With all these clear benefits of the single market, why is it so difficult? Why is there no speed that Martin demanded? And I can say that when I was member of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, I have seen the courage and the enthusiasm that the flagship report calls for in the Commission and in the Council. The thing is that the resistance that is elsewhere leads to fears that one might be overambitious and fail. And this is something that holds back at least the Commission. I think that new forms of cooperation between what is called Brussels and the capitals should better convey what the advantages and the necessities of the single market are. I see that there are steps taken in this direction with, for example, with the single market enforcement task force. I also feel that this instrument could help to make it better known that there are instruments now from the national levels to do more. In the report to the Parliament that SEPS contributed to, and Jacques Bergmans in particular, I read that the Solvit instrument, for example, is not used by industry. So I wonder where this comes from. Why is it not known, or is it not attractive enough, and has it to be adjusted that opportunities that there are now are better used? And these are my comments for this roundtable.
Thanks a lot, Andreas. Thank you for these insights, but also for your critical comments. I think we move right away to Nathalie Irard. It's interesting to have an industry representative in this panel, of course, apart from Martin, who gave the introductory remarks. But of course, we do not associate Airbus too much with the single market. We associate it with a global player. You speaking about the global markets. So Nathalie, what are your insights, views, or comments on what you've heard?
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation, and I will try to give my perspective, Airbus and the single market, and that will echo, I think, some of the ideas which have already been expressed. I mean, of course, 15 years ago, Airbus was a startup, and the single market did not exist at that time. It was not even mentioned. Nevertheless, there was a strong alignment, political will, the need of scale, the need to keep some strategic autonomy for a global business, and a business which is dual by nature. And all that drove further integration. And the journey was long, but Airbus did it, gradually increased its market share, now selling worldwide in Americas, in Asia, increasing its industrial footprint, and is the #1 in aircraft manufacturing in the world. So it shows that Europeans can achieve a lot of ambition when they decide to. The single market helped Airbus to achieve this worldwide leadership, of course. I would quote two examples which I think are interesting. The first one is the single European aviation market, because with that single market approach in Europe, we saw aviation booming up, we saw competition increasing, airlines fares decreasing, and therefore a strong commercial aircraft market flourishing. The second example I could give about the benefits of the social market, of the single market, was the creation of a single European certification agency, because obviously industrially it enabled us to be more efficient, and the already integrated industrial player could even be more efficient on the worldwide scale. And it allowed as well the EU to have a voice on the worldwide stage on the certification agencies. And of course, the discussion around international standards is key, is a strategic topic for aircraft manufacturer and aviation at large. So now, to gain altitude again after the COVID crisis, Airbus, to be a leader in the future and not only a leader in the past, need to lead the decarbonization of aviation. And I will try to show how the single market can help us get there, because I think its role will be even more critical in this second phase. So COVID hurt the aviation ecosystem badly, over 250 billion euros of losses. And an unprecedented effort in innovation and investment is needed to achieve the EU Green Deal that we embrace, and the carbon neutrality in 2050. Of course, we don't start from scratch. Emissions per passenger kilometer had already been lowered by 80% compared to the beginning of the jet age. The EU at national level, through a research program and through Clean Sky and CESAR, have been helping to start funding the transition. But more added economic measure will be needed, which can help absorb inherent extra costs of a more sustainable aviation. So the investment part will be very important. And as Mrs. Jona said, it's not only about regulation, but it's as well about investment, innovation, and incentivization. If I look at where the single market can provide scale and therefore be a critical tool to achieve our decarbonization roadmap, I think of three topics, because zero emission aviation is a challenge, and it will require alignment of all industrial players along with the European authorities. The first challenge is the scaling up of sustainable aviation fuel. Today's aircraft can already fly with the so-called SAF, but we need a mandate, and we need it at EU level. We can't afford to have it fragmented. And this is the EU Refuel initiative of the landmark Fit for 55. Coupled with the Alliance for Low Carbon Emission, we think it can make a difference and can help scale up demand and offer on sustainable aviation fuel. It will mean that we can have short-term benefits and short-term decarbonization results. Secondly, of course, and it's well known by the aviation gurus, European air traffic management can be improved. And we need to get on with the implementation of the single European sky. It's a very difficult topic, because here the alignment at political level is very difficult. But that could, in the quite short term, help us to gain at least 6% of aviation emission reduction. Third example that I would give is related to our strategy to develop a zero-emission commercial aircraft by 2035 and be the first one in the world to do that. We think we can make it and develop an hydrogen aircraft by that time. But developing an aircraft is not enough. We will need to create a new energy ecosystem. We will need to have the infrastructure to enable liquid hydrogen technology propulsion. And that will rely on the single market to harmonize new hydrogen regulation, ensure the availability of energy in the right quantities, at the right place, at the right time, and at an affordable price. It's not that different of the mandate that we spoke about on sustainable aviation fuel. And last but not least, we will need to work on the infrastructure side. And as you know, the airport ecosystem is highly regulated. So to avoid to slow down the new technologies rollout, we will need to work through the single market. It will be the only way to have all member states aligned and to gain scale at European level. By the way, the European level will not be enough because we are a global business. We will need at the international level, but that's the first stage. This is where the EU can leverage its power of alignment. So coupled with the Alliance on Zero Emission Aviation, as well as important projects of common European interest, we can drive the ecosystem and we can make significant inroads. We need to start early, of course. We need to start now because the worst would be to have the aircraft ready and the rules and the infrastructure, the energy, the green energy, not available at the right price in 2035. Ultimately, we need a level playing field at the international level. It will have to start with a framework endorsed by all EU member states. So you see, I hope this example helps you understand the contribution of the single market to Airbus successes in the past and hopefully in the future as well. It was a critical driver, but I think the single market remains essential for Airbus to remain a worldwide leader in the coming decades and help the decarbonization of the aviation industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. Important challenges for you, but you need kind of a new single market in the domain of hydrogens, which of course is still very much in the making. We are still only starting with this. By the way, we published a paper as SEPS on Friday on what it all means if we want to have a hydrogen energy market, which my energy colleagues produced. It's on our website. You can download it. So thanks a lot. Let's say impressive. Let's say to hear also your ambitions to create this zero carbon aircraft by 2050 or even before. I mean, really extremely important because we know, let's say, what today, let's say, is the contribution of airplanes, let's say, to carbon emissions. And of course, it's enormous, let's say, that you have this target within Airbus. Helen, we turn to you because there has been a lot of criticism on member states. I mean, if I look at the chat box, I mean, it's the member states which are all to be blamed for the fact that we don't have a single market. So it's perfect that you can join us and probably have your view from a member state, which has normally seemed to be extremely well managed. How you look at this, Helene? You're on mute, I think. Yes, have you unmute? Unmute, please, Helene.
Thank you very much, Karel, and it's certainly a great pleasure to be able to present a member state's perspective here in this panel today. First of all, I would like to join others in commending ERT's work in presenting us with these stories, because we talk about the importance of strengthening the single market very often. As a civil servant, I have seen this on countless occasions. It's safe to say that in all speaking points that we prepare for our principals, the strengthening of the single market is a fixture. We don't even think twice about it. Of course, it has brought us so much in terms of growth and prosperity. And of course, we are in favor. But these stories now show what is really the reality behind this speaking point. This is the work that still needs to be done. And it's cumbersome work, mostly of a technical nature. And it may not be very sexy at all, but it needs to be done. And that's the importance, I think, of this of today's report and of the ERT's work. It provides us with a mirror. It slaps us right in the face when it comes to opportunities that have not been fully realized, potential that has still been left untapped, and economic value that is lost. I was personally shocked to read that the benefits of removing barriers to the single market could amount to over 700 billion euro by 2029, which is similar to the amount that we are investing in the EU's next generation recovery package. I would like to make 3 points at the outset. First of all, my impression is that this report does a really good job at arguing that strengthening the single market is key also to achieving open strategic autonomy. In fact, this is where open strategic autonomy begins and ends, by putting our own house in order. And the single market is the foundation of that house. Together with others have also mentioned this, the EU's trade policy, our industrial policy, our competition framework, the policies that are in place to spur innovation, all instruments in the toolbox that together will build a competitive and resilient European economy. And these days there is a lot of talk of diminishing the undesirable dependencies in our strategic value chain and ecosystems, achieving open strategic autonomy. It's almost as if this is the fashionable way to reflect on Europe's resilience and its place on the global stage. And you can also certainly understand its appeal to politicians. And it's a good thing too, because Europe needs these ambitions, needs a vision, needs a point on the horizon to work towards. But strengthening the single market is then the hard path to follow if we want to reach this destination and make the most of our future competitiveness. Second question, and this has also been addressed already by previous speakers, why is it so hard to work on the single market? And part of the answer, I think, is that it is a joint responsibility of many actors. We can't just look to the Commission to save the day. And as you rightly pointed out, obstacles are indeed created at the level of member states. And not everyone is easily convinced that harmonization is the way to go. In the Netherlands, we have a single market working group in which all government agencies are represented. And here we prepare the work, for example, that is undertaken in the Single Market Enforcement Task Force, the SMET. It's not easy. There are conflicting interests between the bigger picture of a stronger single market on the one hand and national policy goals or certain methods of implementation on the other hand. But we believe that having the conversation is a start and identifying what can be done is next. Twice a year we present progress in an interagency coordination group as a reminder of the task at hand, but also to reinforce and reconfirm commitment. It's important to have this solid commitment also at the highest level. And that's why it's good to have the SMET's work discussed in the Compet Council. And also European leaders should be kept in the know so that they too can put their full weight behind this work. Not just in response to the pandemic, although COVID has certainly served as a wake-up call and has given a very important impetus to this work. But there is more to be done, certainly also when it comes to achieving the green and digital transitions, or as Kirsten said, the single market economy in transition. That's the time we are in now. And certainly the importance of the single market cannot be overlooked when it comes to these twin transitions. And this brings me to my third and final point, the involvement of business. I would say that it's crucial that business voices are heard and that these stories are also brought to the attention, not just of the Commission, but certainly also in member states' capitals. At this very moment, a new agenda for the SMET is being prepared for 2022. And these stories point to important barriers that could be addressed in SMET and also beyond. So I would say make sure to bring these stories home. In the Netherlands, we try and involve our businesses and their perspectives in the work of SMET by seeking frequent consultations. And it's rewarding if we can solve real-life problems for companies that create economic value, including, of course, SMEs. In that sense, it's disappointing to read that the ERT is not as much involved with the work of SMET. We should have more dialogue, I believe, more calls for action from businesses' side. And I hope and expect that these stories can and should really spark this interaction. Thank you.
Helene, at the end, you meant, let's say, the involvement of ERT in the work of what? Of the SMET?
Of the SMET. The SMET is the Single Market Enforcement Task Force. It's a relatively new instrument, but you know, it's still in the process of course, improving its work. but we feel it's a very welcome addition, and there have been some successes in this single market enforcement task force. For example, when it comes to prior declarations for recognition of professional qualifications, this is the technical and cumbersome work that member states have to engage in together in order to actually tackle these barriers on the single market. It's not going to change the single market overnight, but it will help us to deliver tangible results.
Helene, if I may just add, and Karel, one of the examples that we take, I mean, it's member states coming together and not looking at, are you compliant or not with legislation, but looking at, you know, what's a stupid regulation that stands in the way of economic recovery post-COVID. And one area we discovered was 800 most stupid barriers in the area of professional qualifications. And our target 800. Our target is to remove 400, half of it, and we're above 200 within 1 year.
Very good.
So I think
it is a little bit about simplification. It's not. It's a simplification.
It's simplification, and you know, it's the economy stupid. It's not a legal issue or a compliance issue. It's an economic issue, and that's what we try to bring to that group. And I mean, so far for the first year, it has delivered. And now we're going for more. We'll have a work program for next year soon.
So, Helene, you would say there's a need for more mechanisms like this? A mechanism between member states, administrative authorities?
Yes, well, I think I very much agree with Kirsten that the addition of the SMET to the toolbox has been very useful, and it serves as a very practical way in which member states can also engage in peer review. But it can still be improved, of course, and having consultations with businesses and also taking this report, for example, and these stories and working through them, you know, going through all the barriers that are listed in your study to see which ones we can address, that would be a very good thing. And sometimes, you know, there might be low-hanging fruit. Other issues might be more complicated to tackle, but certainly the low-hanging fruit, we should really engage in it together with businesses.
Okay, I would turn back to Martin. If you all hear this, I just wondered, do we need to rename the single market? I saw the Commission just took an initiative last week to change a word which nobody understood, interconnectedness, to global gateway, which is already a bit clearer. And of course, communicating is also always important. We know the word single market now for 40 years. Have you got any idea? I mean, you as a business leader must be thinking about marketing, let's say, selling your stuff all the time. So you should say, but look, what about having a new name for this?
Yeah, I'm not so sure whether this is the right thing, but just to give it a new label and then it looks like everything is done doesn't help. I mean, first of all, let me express that all the panelists have actually, I think, be having the same opinion about what needs to be done. Everyone has added the aspects from the respective sides. So that gives, I think, quite a positive energy because there's no one who denies that something has to be done. I think there were several good hints. So I think what we should do is now really work on it. And I think what was helpful from Kerstin to give it this new, let's say, stages of the market, because as we said, it was different than 30 years ago, and going forward, having this market economy and then the aspect of transition. So if you want, that are already new names or a 2.0 or 3.0 single market issue. So I think that is done. I think what is really important that we tackle it, and I think it was also mentioned, I think by Helene, who said no one has everything in hand to really do it. So it is a complex interaction. So I have to say this idea with the SMET is really a good one. It was not on my radar screen yet. And you said it's by member states. Why not SMET inviting ERT and some of the leaders to give exactly these examples? So I think there's a lot of energy and a lot of good proposals in the room from this discussion today. So, but renaming is not really the solution.
Any other comments on that? Andreas, for example, from your perspective from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board?
No, I think maybe what came to my mind discussing this, that there is maybe also a fragmentation of activities in the Commission that have the same direction. You, Kerstin, mentioned that you have found 800 examples of regulations that might be removed. The the more comprehensive, better regulation agenda foresees now that there is one in, one out, that in principle, whenever you do a new regulation, you have to take out an old one, that mechanisms like these can also be specific for the single market maybe, or there's room to think about mechanisms that incentivize the removal of regulations at the member state level, or harmonization at the member state level, that could drive the process in a more rule-based way than depending on individual conferences or meetings of this matter.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. There was a comment on the side by somebody saying, do we need to have a shame list of what member states do not do? I would ask this question to Natalie. Would this work? Let's say if ERT were to make a shame list, let's say to put up to the business, to the member states leaders to say, look, these are all the things you promised, but you never did.
Yeah, well, I think we should at least collectively be better at explaining that fragmentation can be a poison to the European industry and the European economy, and give our own examples. And I don't know if it's shaming, but at least this is really stating the obvious sometimes. And this is what we did, for example, when we had this patchwork of decision in the opening of borders or travel restriction last year, and where we called for harmonization of processes and decision. I think we need collectively to be clearer in our words and explain to the public, because we all know as well that there are some political implications and political breaks nowadays. So the public need to understand the consequences of a fragmented approach. It needs to understand that if we want to be successful in the digitalization and the green transformation, we need to get together and with political will and in an aligned way. And I think each of us should communicate more about the disadvantages of a fragmented approach.
Thank you, Natalie. Kerstin, there is I think a comment for you or a question for you. Could we have a semester process in highlighting the single market barriers? Like we know the semester process from the public finance side, from what DG ECFIN is doing?
As you know, I wasn't DG ECFIN and I was in charge of that process. So yes, certainly we need, but that's the discussion, and we put new elements on the table also for the semester process, because now it comes together with a recovery and resilience process, and we need to have a stronger knowledge also on the single market economy, not only the macro element but also the micro element. So I believe we need, whether it's in the semester or somewhere else, but we need a microeconomic pillar as we move on in optimizing the use of the policy tools in this in the single market economy that we are doing. And we're coming up with our second annual single market report soon, which will capture these elements: transition, resilience, supply chain shortages, and to look at these elements. And therefore, I think it's not about the process, it's really about the content. And I mean, the word was mentioned many times, alignment. How do we align these different interests? And this is really what we are good at in Europe. It's a painful process, it's a complex process, but we are good at it. Aligning these different interests, the different tools, the different levels of governance. If you look at hydrogen, for example, we have hydrogen regions, we have hydrogen towns and cities. We have, of course, national hydrogen strategies. We have investors from the whole world coming in, being interested. And what we're showcasing, shiny, is these 700 projects in the pipeline, which are operational between now and 2022. So here we have the projects, the money can come in. There will be projects in other continents, but we'll be able to leverage it and we'll be able to showcase it. And that will allow also our companies then to export. If I may just pick up on one sentence from Helen, she said, of course we are in favor. Single market, of course we are in favor, but now that's how many people talk about it. That's even how you talk about it. You say, in your report, single market, but there's all of this missing. What I would like to get to is that we say, of course we are in favor of the single market and we're acting. And that's the alignment I would be looking for.
No, I fully agree with that. Actually, I mentioned it just to also underline the point that we sometimes take it for granted, and also we sometimes take our support for it for granted. It's all too easily said, but it needs to be followed up by action.
I mean, there is an action point which is raised in the Q&A, Helene, which asks for, does the single market enforcement task force needs to have a higher political profile? Meaning, do we need to have conclusions of this task force, for example, highlighted in the European Council conclusions, which is basically the motor of everything which is happening at European level?
Yeah, we would certainly think so. I mean, you yourself mentioned the importance of communication, and we see, European Council conclusions can be one way of showing also our public that this is serious business for our leaders, and it's part of the narrative about strengthening European ecosystems, value change, this achieving of open strategic autonomy, which the European Council, of course, also expressed itself on. But you can't have one without the other. So the logical sequence, or as Kirsten called it, the mix of instruments. And I very much agree. Also in the ERT report itself, it talks about the complementarity of the industrial strategy and the strengthening of the single market. It's very true. These are all building blocks, and in the end, our end goal is to be a resilient economy in today's world, with all the geopolitical changing context that we find ourselves in. This is the end goal, that we keep our own strategic agency in at the global stage. But yes, the single market narrative is very much part of that puzzle. It's an important condition, I would say. It's the foundation.
Okay, I could probably go for a final comment to Martin, but I have two specific questions. Of course, you've got just a new government in Germany and a big change, which we expect also to see here in Brussels. Do you expect something from that? And related to that, because the government has to be approved in the Bundestag, do you see enough support from elected assemblies to the single market, but that, of course, above all, from the European Parliament, from your perspective, Martin?
Well, I mean, first of all, we expect a lot from the new German government, very clearly. In many respects, I think this famous speech, there has to go a ruck, as we call it, through Germany, which means it's shaking up the nation, I think, in a lot of respects and dimensions. I think if you read the coalition treaty, I think it is a remarkable setup for the challenge that you have three very different parties coming together. I think it's a very good starting point. I'm actually very surprised how quickly and disciplined they have to come to this agenda. Now, basically, tomorrow we will have the government in place, and then let's see how they actually do it. What I can also say, and I think this is important, as I had a lot of interaction with many of the important people now in the government, when you talk to them, they all know that there has to come an impulse for Europe. And I think also the coalition treaty, I think, has the right remarks that a lot of the stuff is not be doable anymore on a national and a German level. And talking to some of them, I think there is clearly the will to engage more in Brussels and give it somehow a momentum. Let me expand that by saying when France got its new government, I really hope that something new is coming in terms of an engine between France and Germany to somehow kickstart a few things. And this is this balance we were talking about, national agenda and European. I hope it swings over after this national emphasis. It swings over a little bit more now to Brussels again, because otherwise we don't make Europe the best place to live. So I am very confident that some new impulse from the new German government is, with respect to Europe, is coming.
Thank you. And of course, I remember there is this phrase in there, we call for a federal Europe, which I think is far-reaching, because it's not necessarily so that you see member states calling for a federal Europe. So that is important. And also some specific proposals within the government coalition ask for more European approaches, like on things like European deposit guarantee scheme, which is an issue, kind of a stumbling block in Germany. But I found that a big step forward. So I hope, let's say, to see this new wind also here in Brussels, I think it can certainly do this as the most important member state of the EU. And with this, I would like to thank you for listening in and to joining us. First of all, big thanks to ERT and to Martin, also to Natalie. I think there was a great report. And I would simply invite everybody to consult it if you haven't looked at it yet, to download it from the ERT's website. I think it's a great contribution to the debate. And I think from the debate we see, we need this. I would also like to thank Helene, let's say, from bringing in her perspective from a member state, which I think is important to understand this interaction between Brussels and the EU member states, which is always a problem. And there were plenty of questions about member states don't do this, like from Malcolm Harbour, which is a former, as I said, chair of the Internal Market Committee in the European Parliament. Also, many thanks to Kerstin for her contribution. It's great to have you, Kerstin, because you're one of the key actors in the European Commission in this domain. And DG Grow, we know it's extremely important, let's say, that this message reaches you, but also your people within your DG. But also we've learned a bit, let's say, about how the way you work with this SMIT initiative, which I think is extremely important. I think there is a need for more like this, more ways by which you cooperate and which you simplify and which you strengthen regulation all over the EU. And also thanks to my colleague Andreas to bring in his expertise from this regulatory scrutiny board and the work he's doing with us today. So with this, thank you very much. I found it a great debate and I hope we can stay in touch. So again, Martin, Helene, Natalie, Andreas, Kerstin, thank you very much. And thanks also to my colleagues at CEPS for having co-organized this, and the colleagues from ERT, which have also been listening in for all their work. So this was quite a challenge to get this organized, but I think we did it very well. Thanks a lot, Martin. And
thanks to you, Karel. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.